The Montgomery Bus Boycott made long-term and lasting impacts for the civil rights movement. Although segregation is still not perfect, there is a major improvement from the 1950s and 60s. African Americans now share the same rights as any white person in the United States.
You did not follow my orders. You disobeyed the parade order. Each and every one in this line is under arrest for parading without equipment.
The Montgomery Bus Boycott was a protest for civil rights from 1955 to 1956 that started in Montgomery, Alabama, after Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up her bus seat to a white man. Following that instance, many African Americans refused to ride the city buses, which started the first large-scale protest against segregation in the United States.
Now, many things happened during the civil rights movement that angered the black communities of Montgomery. The major thing that sparked the Montgomery Bus Boycott was the arrest of Rosa Parks. New York State Museum Chief Curator of History Jennifer A. Lemak said the WPC turned its focus towards the mistreatment of blacks on city buses. The WPC was the Women's Political Council, of which Rosa Parks was part of. Her arrest allowed this council to start working on a plan to counteract the mistreatment of blacks. According to historian Stuart Burns, Montgomery bus drivers were required to unseat passengers. This requirement was something that also helped spark the movement along with the arrest. According to historian Stuart Burns, Montgomery bus drivers were required to unseat passengers. This requirement was in place specifically to target black people. This was because of the Jim Crow laws. Now, despite Brown v. Board of Education being a case taken to the Supreme Court where the verdict ruling segregation in public schools and places being unconstitutional, according to author Sonia Benson, the decision brought no immediate changes to Montgomery, Alabama, later explaining that there were many people involved. There were even major influential people such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., both of which were well known for their protests.
In 1955, African Americans were still required to sit in the back half of buses, and if the bus were to fill up, they would have to give their seat up to a white person. Rosa Parks was an activist for the civil rights movement. She was arrested because she would not give her seat up to a white man. Following her arrest, civil rights activists agreed to boycott for across Montgomery.
Seconded that the resolution as read will be received and adopted. Are you ready for the question? All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet.
Nonviolent protests. In specific, one was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which according to New York State Museum Chief Curator of History Jennifer A. Lemak, the Montgomery Bus Boycott was one of the first major victories in the civil rights movement. This demonstration involved the black community of Montgomery, Alabama, purposely avoiding the bus system and finding an alternate form of travel through carpooling. The Montgomery Bus Boycott had a lot of significance during the time. This is in part to having the ability to bring together many different protesters to fight back against something that was wrong. According to author Sonia Benson, as the boycott continued, the MIA laid out its demands to the city, courteous treatment by bus drivers. This evidence alludes to the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, and despite Alabama not taking much action, the ruling allowed the African Americans to gain hope, come together with encouragement, eventually fighting for proper treatment and to stop segregation.
Let us fight passionately and unrelentingly for the goals of justice and freedom. Let's be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. Let us never fight with falsehood and violence and hate and malice, but always fight with love so that when the day comes that the walls of segregation is completely crumbled in Montgomery, we will be able to live with people as their brothers and sisters.
The roots of the boycott began years before the actual arrest of Rosa Parks. The Women's Political Council, or the WPC, had already turned their attention to the Jim Crow laws within city buses. With the Jim Crow laws being very present in Montgomery, Alabama, the black community was tired of being kicked out of their seats to benefit the white people taking them. According to the article by Stanford University, Montgomery Bus Boycott, Martin Luther King Jr.'s main goal of the boycott was to show the power of a growing self-respect to animate the struggle for civil rights.